Welcome everyone to another Every Other Friday D&I one-on-one. I'm Jina Etienne. I'm the host of the series. I am a CPA, former life in practice. Today I'm a DEI consultant and I offer training and workshops as well as do coaching and keynote speaking on all things D&I and culture. I'm excited today to have with me Dr. Carlotta Roman. She's founder and senior business psychologist at Collective Career Consultants, LLC. Her firm provides advisory, coaching, training, and support for DEI efforts and to drive diversity and facilitate organizational change. You know, at the end of the day, DEI is about culture change, which is why I'm so excited to be having this conversation with her today. Now, I will share, I was excited to learn that Carlotta loves the thrill of trying most outdoor activities at least once, like skydiving and parasailing and snowboarding. She and I have one thing in common: ain't nobody doing bungee jumping, because that's just ridiculous. She loves her Southern roots and makes an exceptional gumbo dish, which I've not yet tasted. And a fun fact, she participated in the Miss Corporate America competition and won second runner-up. But she quickly retired because, you know, high heels, and I can relate to that. I dressed up the other day for work, and I mean, I'm talking about in my office, in my home office, wore shoes, wore high heels, made it to the kitchen, and I was done. So thank you, Carlotta, for joining me today. I just want to kick things off with a question, and that is, how do you tie culture change and DEI together?
So for me, tying DEI and culture change together is all within the mission and the values of an organization. So that's where it starts with why the organization exists and what's their North Star. So that's how I shape culture and help organizations to envision DEI around that.
So let's start before we get in trouble. I forgot to do this. We're going to launch our first polling question. And while they're answering that question, we can maybe chit chat a little bit. So I don't know, maybe I'll read the question, Beryl. What area do you represent within your organization? So this is going to be interesting, Carlotta, because we'll get to see who's with us and from where in the organization they work. Do you think that this makes a difference in terms of how our participants can take this information away? Like, if I'm not in HR, is this something that I can, you know, think about in my role day to day? And as I'm asking this, I realize that we're going to be like halfway through the poll here.
Yes, so really anyone in any part of an organization, regardless of the type of organization, takes part in change management. It impacts every stakeholder that is a part of the change. So just kind of seeing who's in the room helps me to position some of the things that I'll be talking about today. But everyone has a job around supporting change, as well as we already know everyone has a job of taking ownership, a part of DEI. Not any one person is responsible for that alone.
You know, it's so true, because DEI is the cumulative effect of everybody in the organization. And yes. I can see here 75% of people said other. So not that many people involved in DEI, change management, or HR that are with us today. So what you said is really important, that they can be involved from no matter where they are. So I have this list that we put together of all the things that we can touch on today. And by the way, everyone, I encourage you, if you have a question, ask it throughout. We will try to address questions at the end, but I always like taking them as we go along. So can we start then, Carlotta? We didn't really script this, everyone. You know, this is a conversation. But I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is, if an organization wants to drive a DEI strategy or think about doing DEI, a lot of small organizations think, where do we start? What do we do? Does it start with defining it, or does it start with understanding change management? What is your approach to that?
Well, first, it starts with understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. So before we can latch on to a model, a concept, or shape our processes, we have to be educated about the field of DEI. Oftentimes people are throwing together all kind of acronyms: diversity, equity, inclusion, D&I, social justice. But what do all of these things mean? And are we really tackling each of these areas at the same time? So that's the first place that we all need to start from as an organization and as individuals, to understand diversity, equity, and inclusion and the lenses that we look through as individuals and professionals and as organizations. So there are many change models that we'll highlight today, but there are some that really help to start the foundation of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So these change models that you're going to talk about, do they really focus on culture change, or are these things that we can think about when driving any change? Because organizations have long-term strategies, short-term project initiatives, things like that. All of them to some degree require change, but does everything require a change management process?
Well, the models that I'll talk about today definitely take culture in mind. So anytime that you're making a change to the organizational level, is going to impact the overall culture. And even as we were already mentioning and having our kind of discussion coming in, there are multiple subcultures that exist within organizations. Mm-hmm. So taking those inventories in mind are important because it'll impact and shape the type of change that you're impacting. Now, every change that will take place in an organization doesn't necessarily need to have a formal change management plan, but I think that it's important to always think about the stakeholders that we're impacting. That's the same thing in terms of DEI. The services, the recruiting, the processes that we make, how is it impacting each individual, groups of individual, and look at intersectionality and how it can play.
What's interesting is that understanding the human dynamics and change in an organization isn't going to happen because we get new computers, or we were chit-chatting before we went live about technology shifts in technology, and we can be really resistant to that. So things like that are hard, but any change starts with my willingness to change. And some of us say we're okay with change. Some of us say we like change, but doesn't the data tell us we don't change easily or willingly? I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad way, to be fair, just as human.
Oh yeah, definitely. The data goes all the way back to evolution, as they say. What our body tries to do is to help us to survive. People always leverage is either fight or flight. So when change is happening and it's too rapidly, your body is resisting. So that's going to come out in how you feel and how you think. But definitely what we want to do is to help people feel like they're a part of the change, and change is not happening to them. And you already said a key word: human. It's the human side of change. And that's what change management is about, is looking at how it's impacting the people side of change. Project management is more of the technical, software, the process, the resources that we're going to implement. So the human side of the change is why we have change management.
It's interesting because we all want to change the things that we think need to change. So I'm highly motivated, for example, to change to, I don't know, let's say I'm in an organization that doesn't use a Mac, but I use a Mac at home. So I'm thinking, I think we should create a change in policy where if you want to use a Mac, you can. And I'm totally motivated for that, right? But then there are other people who would resist it. We should have the same technology. It shouldn't be different anywhere else in the organization. Uniformity is important. So does that friction influence, and I'm thinking about how all of this will ultimately play out in any change strategy, but I'm just thinking about human behavior.
Yeah. That friction definitely impacts change management. It definitely impacts diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And the thing that I let people know is that it's about managing resistance, managing those differences, not trying to eliminate. Can't eliminate those. We're human. As long as we're human, there's going to be some differences that
It's
will
called diversity.
Exactly. It's called diversity. So taking all of that into mind and allowing everyone to have a voice is important. And that's where inclusion comes. We want to hear all voices. Decision making, certain things will be prioritized, but we definitely want to hear all of that. And I think the last thing that I'll say in this area is that I always say, give me the good, the bad, and the ugly. The only thing that does not work is information that I do not know.
Fair. That is such a good point. And this is particularly important for leaders because leaders don't always get the feedback from the rest of the organization, and people will follow what the leaders are doing, sometimes more than what the leaders are saying, because I'm looking out and following the example of my peers and my colleagues. And actually, this gets me to this question, that this third bullet here on organizational psychology. Can you talk a little bit about that? You actually have a slide here with the definition. Can you explain a little bit more, and how does that relate to what we're talking about in terms of D&I?
Yeah, organizational psychology is really just observing and studying individual and organizational behavior. So some may be familiar with the term industrial and organizational psychology. So if we're thinking about the US and many countries being industrialized countries, and you think about manufacturing, so an IO psychologist or someone in HR may study the dynamics of people, the organization, and the resources that they use, and what's the behavior in that. So with DEI, we've come along to understanding that it's much more than just a compliance piece. It's an ethical piece. It's tied to human rights when we look at it from a global perspective. So we can become aware, but we also have to study how people are impacted due to a change around diversity, equity, inclusion. So we may be really focusing on the D part to get the right representation, to have multiple people within an organization. But if that's where we stop and we don't hit on inclusion, then we start to see resistant behaviors. Then we start to see high turnover, and then we start to see initiatives fall by the wayside. So organizational psychology looks at that dynamic when we think of it from a diversity lens.
I think of, and I often talk about organizations as ecosystems.
Yes.
And if you think of an ecosystem, it's almost organic as in and of itself. And so when I think organizational psychology, I'm thinking of an organization almost as a human. Collectively, that ecosystem has all of those dynamics. And at the end of the day, especially in accounting and particularly in public accounting firms, we don't build widgets. We just bring our minds to work and do great work through thought. I mean, it seems a little oversimplistic, but it really is. And as a result, the way we show up every day is going to influence that,
But that's so important to understand that we are part of a system. So organizations are systems. The way in which we complete processes and make decisions are systems. Even culture is a system. Going back to what you already said, that leaders set the culture. Leaders set the culture based upon how they behave. That sends a message to employees in terms of what's acceptable. So that's a system and a structure that's being set up. And every system is an open system. Nothing is a closed system. So it's going to be influenced by internal and external factors. And as we see with diversity, equity, and inclusion, more and more of our personal and professional lives are integrated into our organizational culture. So we can't just look at the number side in the business case for DEI for the increased profitability. We still have to see how we impact people, because we have a lot of external factors that are changing, and organizations as a system have to be redesigned and change with change management to support DEI as a long-term initiative.
So I promise she didn't do this on purpose, but it is time for a second polling question, and this is perfect. Where is your workplace culture when it comes to implementing change effectively? And I love this question because it gets to what we were saying earlier. You know, people say they want to change, but that doesn't mean they're ready to do the work of change. Well, if an organization is like a human, then it's somewhere along that same spectrum. So it's going to be really interesting to see how these results play out.
Exactly. I mean, as we all know, with the last 5 years, right before the pandemic in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, we saw a lot of organizations really stand up and say, we need to take inventory. We need to hear about the experiences of our employees. So there were a lot of listening sessions, a lot of focus group sessions, and a lot of information and data that was gathered, and money dedicated to DEI, chief diversity officer roles. However, it's kind of fallen by the wayside. It's kind of went quiet, and we saw even a retraction in roles and hiring. So organizations may say they want to change, but they may not know how to change. So having a formalized plan or some direction helps with that.
So I'm looking at the results. I think this poll is going to close any moment. And then I can see here 11% say not ready, 16% a little bit ready. But we have all the other, at the other end, 21% ready, 14% say they are practicing and leading the way. So this is really encouraging because we're seeing that organizations are preparing themselves for change. So maybe this is a good time to, there are a lot of slides, folks. You have a copy of the slides. We may not talk about all of these, but they're a great reference if you want to go learn more. But Carlotta, is there one that you like in particular or that you find most effective, especially when we're talking about culture change, mindset change around DEI?
So, I'm going to start with the tried and true one, and that's Cotter. Cotter's 8-step framework for change. And this one has been around a long time, and a lot of organizations find it very simple to engage with the 8-step process. So as you can see, when we start to think about change, we do need to create a sense of urgency. So we want to change. We have an idea as individuals of something we want to do. There might be some motivation, or as organizations, hey, I see that this is important to my employees. I see things are happening in society. Okay. But if I'm snelling along, where I'm not really committed and change is not going to happen. So creating a sense of change and building a coalition around the change. So even though in our earlier poll, we had HR, we had change practitioners, but really everyone in the organization should be a part of that coalition. So one thing for us is to look at how do we have diversity around that coalition. So each individual stakeholder or department that's represented in an organization should be a part of a coalition of change. So then you take it down to the strategic vision of the organization around the change, and communication. Oh my gosh, just in daily life across cultures, communication will always be the number one factor in terms of the success of change, in terms of the success of us coming together around DEI to hear our different perspectives, to understand others' lived experience. We have to be able to communicate. And it takes really you through other pieces in which you can identify obstacles, not necessarily people who may not buy in, but hearing their voice and bringing them along in that. And of course, we have creating some short-term wins because, hey, we need those milestones. We need to say, hey, we're doing it, we're making it. And it really helps to anchor change within the culture. So
early wins are so important because if it takes a long time to see anything happening, people will lose faith very quickly. Why are we doing this? This is pointless. Anybody got time for that? There are all kinds of thoughts that will get in the way, and we're just going to fall right back into the status quo.
And the key point around that is communication again. I really like when organizations can honestly assess that, hey, we may not be ready. We're not there. We're really starting from ground zero. That's okay. We all start at different areas in the journey around DEI and with change. So as long as that you know that, then you can build that coalition. And I think when organizations are honest that we don't have all the answers, we haven't completed that yet, but we want to hear your feedback from their employees, you get more buy-in and trust to say, hey, you know what? I'm here, I'm committed, I'll be along this change as a participant and a decision maker.
Now, you've talked a couple of times and you've used the word stakeholder. And we know that stakeholders, or a lot of people think stakeholders are bosses. So can you talk a little bit about the diversity of stakeholders that you're referring to? Because they are all involved in all of these stuff, in all of these methods.
So stakeholders can be at multiple levels. So first, everyone that's in the room right now, you are a stakeholder. So each individual person is a stakeholder in our organization. So when it comes to change management, and I think of a traditional organization, someone from HR, someone from IT, someone from accounting, someone from customer service. If I could have one person from each area be a part of that guiding coalition around change and the strategy, those are our stakeholders. We're making sure that we keep their voices and what impacts them in terms of that process. If we think DEI, we think of just diversity. And if we have an organization that is predominantly majority of one DEI characteristic or category, our stakeholders might be all of those other groups that are not represented and bringing them into the fold. So stakeholders can represent from the individual level, organizational level, and department level.
It's interesting because a lot of people think stakeholders, well, actually, stakeholders are those who either have the money in the game. So these are your shareholders in an accounting firm. These might be your equity partners. When in fact, as you just said, it's all levels, it's all roles, and even more importantly, or I don't want to say more importantly, but equally important, which doesn't necessarily get factored in, is diversity in terms of the mix of identities. And you might not have representation. For example, you might not have a woman that's running a department.
Yeah.
But you want to make sure you have a woman at the table when you're developing these strategies and ensuring that you are hearing everyone. So representation is certainly an important part of identifying your stakeholders, because otherwise you have perhaps a bunch of men, but there's no gender diversity. There might be every other kind of diversity. And we're talking about holistic diversity in trying to drive some of these changes.
Yes, especially as we adapt in technology. We have 5 generations in the workplace. So making sure all of those generations are represented in whatever we do. When we think of artificial intelligence and we think of new technology, we have to, it's an imperative, have the younger generation at the table. And I am tired of everybody still talking about millennials. Look, millennials are in their late 20s, early 30s. Hey, it's time to start.
They're even in their 40s now.
Oh yeah, it's time to talk about the next group and what they may or may not be doing well. But having every voice at the table is very vital to supporting change and for it to be sustainable. So age, gender, generation, multiple areas, and even when we start to talk about functional positions, making sure that every department or every stakeholder in that capacity is at the table, or at least being considered for their feedback.
Yeah. All right, pick another one. Which one do you want to talk about?
All right, well, I have to represent with pro side. I would be, really not being, this is kind of my favorite. And if you kind of heard how I said favorite, that's that Southern accent coming out. I love pro-side change management. Well, one, I'm certified in pro-side change management, but a lot of organizations love the ADKAR model. So there are 2 parts to pro-side change management method. There's the organizational change, a 3-step process. But then there's the ADKAR model, which is for individual change. So earlier you asked the question, does every change need to have maybe a formalized process? And no, I think with the ADKAR model, it's something that you can latch onto to help you influence at the individual level others around change. So let's say we just took DEI and we wanted to reach across the aisle to understand the lived experience of others, regardless of the category in which they identify. The first thing is I want to become aware of my need to change, to understand. Then building that desire, that knowledge. Then there's the ability and the reinforcement. So when it comes to change management, ACCAR is a great tool for individuals to use to drive change, but especially managers and supervisors, because they have the biggest impact on the success of change and initiatives. So ACCAR is golden. It's something that really next to the Cotter model that organizations tend to love and to use. A lot of them want to use the ACCAR without the 3-step, but both are good, and I love it.
It's interesting because when you look at all of the ones that you've listed, and I look at the work that I do, I live in that space that you're talking about. I live in the space, like the ADKAR space, but a little bit of that nudge method, because it's really, all of these systems are important to understand. So the work that you're doing in terms of identifying your stakeholders, building out a communication plan so that as you put together the strategy to implement change and talking about it, there's also the fact that each individual in that organization has to work within themselves.
Yes.
And so that, self-awareness is a journey. We know that. But I don't know that we've always talked about self-awareness in the workplace. We didn't used to have feelings at work. You leave your feelings at the door and then you come to work and do your thing. This isn't personal, it's business. And now we know today more than ever that's changed. So I love the fact that you say you can look at them separately, even though they're related. Because that tells now everybody here who is not part of the change management team, this is something that you can work on.
Oh yeah, we all are responsible for change and giving our input, but I really like the perspective that you said around the feelings, because we know authentic leadership is what's important. Authentic contribution is what's important. It's vital to our clients' experience. It's vital to really the way in which we do business, for us to show up with those feelings, with my lived experience as a woman, as an African American, or whatever generation that I'm in, or my positioning in the world, is important for me to bring that to the organization, because there could be a client out there, or there could be something that I have to have in mind as we build a process. So I don't want anyone to think that they can't be a part of change around DEI or just any type of initiative in an organization.
I made a note here. I don't even remember where you said it, but it got me thinking about the importance of culture and the humans. I thought about mergers. We were talking about earlier about firm acquisitions and mergers, and I have a client who it's a fairly small firm. Don't know the number exactly, but I'm going to say less than 300 people. And they made an acquisition of another firm, a small firm, but they're in another city. And so now they're one firm, but they're in 2 cities. And if you go to their offices, it feels like you're in a different firm. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges of thinking about culture change is, well, which culture? Or is it a new culture? And if you don't address culture, can that merger be successful? Have you seen anything like that, especially now that we recognize that there is tremendous diversity? We hope everybody now knows when we're talking about D&I, we're not just talking about race and gender identity and disability. We're talking about the broad spectrum of diversity. Those other categories are important because of history of marginalization and discrimination. So we have to pay attention to those, but they're not the only ones. So I'm not asking a question so much as maybe what your thoughts are when mergers don't fail, because it's the people that make all the difference in the organizations.
Yeah, it's the people that make the difference in the organization, but really the failure and the people comes from the leadership. So the leadership has to set the tone to the success of a merger and an acquisition or a culture change. I mean, people are going to be people. Resistance is going to be resistance, but employees and stakeholders are looking for structure. They're looking for clear communication, and they're looking for active and visible leaders to walk out the vision. And that's really some of those foundational things to pro-size change management model. So starting with what we say the end in mind of our future state and where we want to be, and back up from that and say, how do we need to show up? Expect, as they say, the unexpected, or Murphy's Law for things to go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we got to be comfortable with the unknown. So having the proper structure and a guiding light, and trusting that people will find their way in the parameters that we set. So it's okay for someone to feel uncomfortable. It's okay for someone to say, you know, I feel like I'm losing out on something. Well, it's important for me as a leader or someone that is a member that is a part of the change to say, hey, let's sit and have a conversation. These are the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are the benefits of really shaping our organization around this change initiative. So when it comes to multiple cultures, you are correct. If it's not set correctly, it's going to undermine the success of what happens at a particular site. But it's okay to have multiple subcultures within an organization, as long as everything aligns up to the goals and the strategy. Because when we think about global diversity, there's no way we can say the culture at the US site, the Canadian site, the European site, the South African site is going to be the same, because it needs to be unique to those particular regions, but align up to the greater strategy and mission.
Right. See, I was hoping you were going to keep talking because I feel a sneeze coming on.
So change sometimes make you sneeze a little bit.
Oh, is that what it is?
You're excited, yeah.
I want to go back to this slide if we could for a second, because there was something I was hoping you would lean into a little bit, and that is, oh, maybe it's not this slide. Maybe you haven't talked about it. Let me see.
Could it be nudge, or?
Let me go here and look. So maybe it is here. Number 2, consider your changes from the employee's point of view. So I'm going to ask the question, then maybe you can come back and talk about the whole idea. But the whole with them thing, you know,
Yes.
It's one thing for me to be motivated to change for my own reasons, but there's got to be a broader why in the organization that I can connect with. So can you talk a little bit about this while I go on mute and try not to sneeze?
Yeah, so when we think about an employee's point of view within change, especially organizational change, our frontline employees that are touching the employee and that experience, their voice needs to be heard, because really they're the ones that really know what's really going on. As we said earlier, there's a different perspective between what leaders have and what people throughout the organization have. So hearing their voice, having focus groups, having surveys, doing job analysis and observations are important in terms of what's missing. The other with them is let employees be a part of the team or the decision making. That way we can have what we call change champions. Sometimes we even use DEI champions. And this helps to keep clear communication of what's happening at the top and within other parts of the organization. So we have to consider change from our employees' point of view, or they're going to feel like change is happening to them. Their perspective is not taken into consideration. So as we're sharing examples, when we think about technology change, we may have people that are not comfortable with technology. We may have older workers. We may have workers where English is not their first spoken language, and maybe it's a US company where English is the predominant way of doing business. All of those pieces need to be taken into perspective, because we cannot have what I like to call a heartless approach to, either you fall in line or, you find somewhere else to work. We're already facing a labor shortage. We cannot afford to lose high quality people that are passionate and fit the culture. So culture is one thing. That's the values. That's how people show up. And then the design and the technical part is something that can be learned along the way. But finding the right people with the passion, that's hard to come by. I think you're still on mute.
We do have, thank you, a recruiting challenge right now in this industry. And then, I'm hearing it from all sides, all firm sizes. We are struggling to retain talent. So if you can't attract talent and then retain the talent you attract, and then you are not retaining your existing talent, we are in a really bad situation. And business is really going well in the accounting profession right now. Ours is an industry, thankfully, that for the most part is resistant to recession. We tend to do well in all economies because every business needs accountants and big companies need audits. So I think that's understanding, and you said this earlier, but I'll just phrase it a little differently. We have to think about culture. We have to think about the changes we need to make, because otherwise we're going to hire people in and they won't stay. And so it doesn't matter if you really do a good job of attracting diversity if you don't think about what it's going to feel like when they get there.
It's sort of like all the effort that goes into attracting new customers. Think about the Super Bowl, all the millions of dollars that go into a 30-second ad. If we treat our employees the same way to keep them there, the intellectual property, the knowledge, the commitment of employees, new idea, definitely innovation, but employees during a recession that we're facing, that they're not going to jump ship and go somewhere else, but they're going to stick with you through the long run. Those things are so important. So, hey, treat your employees that you have just like you treat your clients, because you want them to stay, you want them to keep coming back. So I think once we can have that perspective, we will be golden.
So what is our third polling question? I'll get to it in just a second. All right, I want to share two comments that came in the Q&A. One is Gen Z gets slammed on a daily basis. So I just want to give the shout out there because that came in.
And, all right, Gen Z counterparts.
And then another person just said, I think it was the same person, that change must happen with employees and not to employees, because too often the leaders will say, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And to your point, you said this earlier, you can get with the program or get out. And without realizing, you might lose your top talent because they see a different way of doing things. And we know these new younger generations, not necessarily just Gen Z, they see a different way of doing things. And if you don't invite that input, people will leave. I mean, and is that what you want?
No, that's not what we want. I'm pretty sure Elon is not watching this webinar, but think about recently with Elon Musk taking over Twitter and kind of the interest that he made. I think he came in with a sink, but letting people go, of course, from an operational standpoint and for the company to do well, you got to do certain things, but the way in which we do it. So I think some employees were let go and they were locked out, and then Twitter couldn't figure out a certain process, around an initiative that they were doing. So
yeah,
you got to take inventory. I think another
example. Sorry.
I think another perspective, as we are talking about innovation and technology and younger generations, we can't forget about all the knowledge of workers that are, senior on the other end of the perspective. Being able to have that experience is important. We have a lot of organizations looking to push people out, but instead, how about leveraging people as consultants in terms of that? Because you can't get experience overnight. That's something that you cannot produce.
Yeah. That diversity of thought and experience is important. All right, I'm going to go ahead and launch this ask us to maybe launch this third polling question, which one is this? Which of the following has your organization experienced when implementing change? So this is great. So it's either a lack of executive support, an active sponsorship, a lack of effective communication, which led to misalignment, lack of change buy-in, and solution support creating resistance, limited knowledge and resources for change management, or just change-resistant culture and attitude. I mean, maybe we should have said, check all that apply.
Yeah.
Because it's that complicated. And in some ways, we've been talking about change as this overarching process and structure, and there's methodologies to it. Yes, this is true. But there's dollars involved, and leadership has to be committed to spending the dollars and sustaining the effort through the ups and the downs. Somebody wrote in here in their answer, none of the above. That's a good choice. Maybe we should have had that as an option. Thank you, Kathy. We didn't put that there. So maybe not everybody's experiencing all of these barriers.
Yeah, so with the barriers that we have here, the things in which people may experience when implementing change, all of these are the top 5 reasons why change projects fail, according to ProSci's research.
And so I'm looking at the results, and they're pretty split. The first one is 11%, but the rest is like almost 20, almost 20, almost 20, and then the difference from the 11 balances out. But so that's fairly even, to your point, that none of these are particularly uncommon. It's not a question of if in many cases, it's a question of when, and then having a plan to address it so that you're not surprised by it.
And I think communication oftentimes tends to be among the top 1 or second one in terms of what people experience with barriers. So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we definitely see, as I've already mentioned, lack of funding, a lack of commitment to it. We're even seeing in government sectors and in states, there's a lot of legislation that's coming in terms of rolling back DEI education. So if an organization really wants to be committed and they want to show that to their stakeholders, their employees, we almost really can't just have DEI as on top of the things that we do. We have an ERG, employee resource group. We have cultural awareness, and we may have some different succession planning and mentorship, but we still have an old system. We have to go to organizational design. We have to go back to our strategy. We have to look at how we've created job positions, how we reward people, our processes, our communication. All of that has to be looked at through a DEI lens. And that is an organizational change that is happening.
Yep. And it's happening in real time. And what's interesting is, and one of the things we're seeing is organizations are resistant to this. But the organizations that are embracing it, we are starting to see case study after case study after case study that shows it doesn't seem like DEI has a return on investment per se, because it's so distributed, if you will. You just listed a bunch of different areas. And so unless you can connect those all together, but we're seeing organizations that do that well, they're showing improved retention, better recruiting, and more profit. And so the case studies are there. It's just a matter of maybe reframing it so that it's not just, it's the right thing to do. We want people to be happy. That's part of it, but that's not all of it.
Yeah, I think it's asking an organization probing questions on how they see DEI. Because time and time again, when I'm hearing that, they're only thinking about the D part. Well, let's hire, more people of color or minorities and get them in. But what about the inclusion part? What are you doing once they get there? What about the equity and access part? Because we know there are those barriers and people are starting further behind. But even at the same time, if you have the internal makeup of DEI, how are you expressing that outwardly in your products and your services? So it definitely makes sense, and the data is there in terms of our changing demographics.
I'll also add, when we talk about, so the D does get a lot of emphasis. I think well-intended effort. And sometimes the E gets excluded or ignored or overlooked. And I think that's important. Something you just said, the E in addressing practices and systems is really important to become aware of them as you bring in a more diverse workforce. Might they run into something that other employees haven't? But by the same token, you also have existing employees who've been running into barriers the whole time. So even if you don't actively or successfully recruit minority talent or diverse talent, because it's going to take a while.
Yeah.
Working on equity and understanding the systems and the barriers, that is driving change in your organization in a way that supports and helps everybody thrive. So I think that that's an important thing to think about. Drop the D, drop the I, look at the E. And I'm not saying you don't want to do all of them, but I'm saying there's a there's a different way to look at each of these things and their connection to changing culture and improving profitability and efficiency of an organization.
Yeah, the E is the hard work. That's why I tell people, the E is when you're rolling up your sleeves. So people get engulfed in, when we talk about affirmative action previously. Affirmative action was kind of the earlier approach to trying to connected to civil rights. So civil rights, affirmative action, to multiculturalism, to now to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But you're right, everyone is a part of that. So the E is the tough work. The E is where we are focused on particular groups of people and giving them the resources they need. But I would also like to say that it's important for everyone to know that they have a diversity story.
Yep.
So oftentimes we're talking about allyship and we're talking about white fragility and white privilege. The thing that I like to say is that we're all born into this system that has existed. We all should say, what is my proximity to the construct of race? It is a system that was established. So no one present day created this system. So myself as a, African American, what's my sense of the construct of race? If I was someone that identified as Caucasian or white, what's my concept of race? And how does the system maybe favor me or exclude others? But, if we just say white males, you have someone that's young, you have someone that's older, you have someone that's married, that's diversity right there.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You have a diversity story. If we can jump to the workplace inclusion model, this is one that I guess I'll use to kind of align to what we're talking about when we're saying, well, how do we?
Sorry, real quick. I just want to note the time. There are only a handful of questions in here. So when you're done this, I'm going to drop us into the Q&A and see if we can't knock those out. We have about 7 minutes left.
Okay, so I was going to say this particular model is very good for helping an organization to scale. So this is the workplace inclusion model that really looks at leveraging your differences within your organization to really create a competitive advantage. So level one is the internal work around DEI, and then tying it to your community. How can you collaborate? So if we start with including more representation in the organization, we can do recruiting with a local high school or a local association. And then you can tie it to legislative pieces on level three with state and national. And then when we start thinking of international, we start thinking of human rights and labor laws that go into that. And then where we really see a lot of new progressive diversity work is around social justice and corporate social responsibility. So that really speaks to the footprint that organizations are leaving in communities and in countries.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. And like I mentioned, we didn't get to go through all of them, but what I would encourage people to do is look up the different slides and just, you can look up these different models, and there are others, but so these are all great. Maybe we should just done a session on walk through all the models. So questions, just a handful I see here. Are there ways, sorry, I'm leaning all in. Are there ways to infuse life and organic collaboration into a sterile corporate environment? Some work cultures are sit at your desk, do your work, and talk to 5 or 7 people. That's it. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say if an organization has a intranet, so what does an organization use in order to foster communication and collaboration? So if you have SharePoint, or some people use Yammer, it's sort of like the professional version of Facebook. But how do we create these little communities in order to start to get to know people on a more interpersonal level outside of just the technical and in our work area? So what are some commonalities we have that we can share and build upon that? And I think that's where the beginning of DEI starts from, when we're getting to know people's culture and their lived experience before we really tie it to the business imperative.
My organization practices change leadership and DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and I'm going to go with accountability, or
Right,
I'm sorry, accommodation, accessibility. Different organizations, there are lots of different meanings. But the head of the organization does a lot, but they clearly aren't having a meaningful or beneficial impact on the staff and organization as a whole. So I think this is really just a comment about really great ideas, not necessarily cascading impact is the way I heard it. Have you seen that happening a lot?
Yeah, that's still, even though it's good intentions, it's still changes happening to people. People may not understand why we're doing something. A good example of this is when we see during certain periods of time throughout the year that companies will just change their logo to many different colors to, kind of support LGBTQ issues and,
Right.
different perspectives. Or Juneteenth, it's a new holiday, but let's have some Juneteenth ice cream. What is that supposed to do? So how do we really hear the voice of our clients, the
Right.
voice of our employees, and say, hey, what's some of your ideas? This is what we're thinking. This is what we would like to do. What could this look like in your area of business or with a particular group of people? And it becomes personalized as ownership, and people are engaged, and it drives to change.
At a previous job, I was interviewing new staff. The head of the department came to me and said, we should hire people that, look like us. My sassy response was, I knew exactly what he meant and didn't agree. Oh, did you mean white men? And hire them based on their resume? Or versus hiring them based on their resume. So I think that's more like a tongue-in-cheek comment. But it's not the first time I've heard that, actually.
Yeah, even if that's just a comment, if I was that person and it's the same identity, I would say, well, we've been doing that. What opportunities have we been missing by not doing something differently?
Yeah, true. Do you see AI forcing change management to adapt? Good question.
I would say yes, because AI is going to challenge everything. What happens is AI has a technical part, but it can't manage the human part, how people react and the resistance part. Someone might say, well, we don't need change leaders anymore. I could just say, I want to do this initiative. What type of model should I use? What's the timeline and what should I do? But what I'm experiencing as a human being in my experience, the economy, lack of income, lack of resources, that's going to show how I show up in the workplace. So I would say AI will be a benefit in terms of the technical part to help free up managing and the people part. It can't get us away from interpersonal conversations.
Yep. Well, and there's some thinking that always will need to be done. So it's a tool. That's all it is. It's a tool.
Exactly.
DEI work is change work. And so understanding how to navigate that is critically important.